Hello, everyone. Welcome to our capacity building session. I hope you can hear me on the other one. Great. So welcome to our capacity building sessions, scheduled from now up to the 20th of October. I mean, with the main purpose or with the main objective of building the capacity of civil society organizations, especially towards COP28. And it's a pleasure hosting all of you. We hope you'll be able to enjoy the session. Yes, this is well planned because we thought usually getting to COP, not so many people, especially youth and CSOs, understand the issue. So we've lined up a number of speakers who would throw more light on this, so that we'll be well prepared before we go to COP. And I hope you'll be able to follow us throughout the period, starting from today up to the 20th. Yes, we formed a WhatsApp group. If you've not joined, the email has been sent. You can join, then we can be updating you every time you have a session so that you'll be able to come to it. And just to zoom directly into no, there are still a lot of people to do. I don't know, I think we 10 minutes to start. I'll introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is just a brief bio about our first speaker and what he'll be talking about. So our first speaker will be talking about the UNFCCC, the UNFCCC processes, the Paris Agreement, and then the Kyoto Protocol, the synergies, and then what are we actually supposed to look for getting to 28 in terms of negotiations. And this is a little bio about our facilitator. He's in the name of Mr. Timothy Damon. He's the founder and president of the Global Youth Development Institute based in the US. And since 2011, he has been deeply engaged in many facets of the UNFCCC process. He's particularly focused on action for climate empowerment, which is ACE, and has served in multitude of roles over the years, including as a focal point for Yongo in 2016, and more recently as an ACE negotiator supporting the delegation bill. So let's all welcome Mr. Timothy Damon. Mr. Timothy Damon, your audience, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Hussein, for the very kind introduction and for convening, along with all of your partners, this whole series of capacity building activities, which I have the honor to to start off. No pressure, right? I will immediately say that, this is a huge topic in terms of how many different agenda items, fields, disciplines are all intersecting, at the COP in terms of what's being negotiated, but then all the other events that are happening. So I'm relieved to say that I only have to set you up with the foundation today, and that the experts that they have lined up for the subsequent presentations in this series, they'll be able to go into more detail on a lot of the different topics, because of course, no one person, myself included, can be an expert on all of the multitude of different agenda items and topics. I know Action for Climate Empowerment very intimately, so I can always talk about that. And usually, my job with my organization is bringing young people to the conferences, and so explaining to them how it works, how do they meaningfully engage there, make an impact, and so forth. So I do have some slides which can also be made available for you following the session. So if you will give me 1 second, I will get those shared on the screen for everyone. All right, everyone should now be able to see the slides. So really today, again, my role is to give the introduction so that even if you're not at all familiar, what is this UN climate change thing? What did they do? Why does that matter? What's that important? How does it work? How could I go there and make an impact? And of course, this is in the context of civil society coming from Ghana, where of course climate change is a very important priority. So to be represented and participate there in COP28, very important. And very much looking for your questions and what you specifically want to know, because again, this is a huge topic, so I always like to tailor things more to where you're at. So we will definitely have plenty of time for the interactive question discussion portion of the event after I go through the basic introductory materials. And yes, the slides will be shared after the discussion. So without further ado, let's get some basic terms out of the way. And this will only be the first few of these terms because there are so many of them, but it's easier. I'll be using these a lot, so it's easier to start with them. So of course, when we say parties, we are referring to countries who have ratified the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so if a country has not actually ratified and become a part of those agreements, they're not actually a party. Then, of course, you have the non-party stakeholders, which is simply anyone else who's not a government. So that's presumably everyone from civil society, whether you're from an NGO, a university, a business. So, it includes the private sector as well, academia. If you're not there on behalf of the government, you're a non-party stakeholder. We use that term a lot. Then, of course, what is the COP, right? That is the Conference of the Parties. And that is the formal annual meeting of all those countries who signed on to all the relevant agreements. And that is where they can formally negotiate and adopt all of the important decisions that they need to do. But within this, because the COP is referring to that framework convention from 1992, and we'll have the list of key moments as well later on, don't worry. But it's important to note that you also have several other bodies. So you have the CMP, or the Conference of Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So basically, it's the COP, but for the parties who signed up to the Kyoto Protocol. And so decisions that need to be taken in relation to the Kyoto Protocol would be taken through that body, not technically the COP. And some of these decisions will actually have to happen in multiple places, but that's where we start to get much more technical about how negotiations work and decisions work. And you then also, since we have a body for the Kyoto Protocol, well, we have the Paris Agreement. And yes, so it has the CMA, the Conference of Parties, serving as the meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement. And it's the same thing except for the Paris Agreement. And that's where you'll see in all the recent years, a lot of the key negotiations were happening under the CMA, because even though we agreed on the Paris Agreement, there was still a lot of details that parties needed to figure out. And that's where they would formally decide on those. And then, as just mentioned, a lot of that work was the Paris Agreement Work Program. People also called it the Paris Rulebook. It went by a couple other ways of referring to it as well. But that was the whole process of negotiating on all the different articles of the Paris Agreement to further elaborate them. Because, of course, if you've read the Paris Agreement, you'll see that, it's relatively not that long. It's a long document, but if you consider how technical climate change is and how much governments need to do to work together, there's a lot that it doesn't say. And so they needed a further process to work that out. And then, of course, you have as well the subsidiary bodies, or the SBs. Now, this is both a physical meeting that occurs also once a year. Sometimes it has happened more than once a year, especially in the lead up to negotiating the Paris Agreement. They needed to meet more frequently, but they meet at least once a year in Bonn, Germany, where you have the headquarters of the UNFCCC Secretariat. And that's a technical meeting. It doesn't have all the side events happening as much, all the pavilions, the fancy things you might have heard or seen or experienced yourself from the COP. Much more, laid back, relaxed procedurally, but still can get very heated over the technical matters and negotiations. And then items that are addressed there actually have their decisions forwarded to the COP. And there are certain items, such as ACE, very frequently that only get addressed at the SB. So you need to pay attention depending on which issues you want to influence, whether those are things also coming up at the SB that you might miss your window of opportunity on, or you'll be late to the party when you get to the COP if you didn't also engage with the SB. But then the SBs themselves refer also not just to that meeting, but to two specific bodies: the subsidiary body for implementation. As the name says, it works on issues for how parties actually implement all the things that they've agreed to. So many important agenda items fall under there. And then you have the SUBSTA, subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. And they handle a lot of the scientific and technical things. And that includes then also, that's where there's been debate in the past over recognizing or taking note of the reports of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Because again, SUBSTA is where you have the nexus of science formally into the negotiations, which are otherwise political, right, between governments. So having gotten those basic terms out of the way, that will help us now as we go into talking a little bit about the geopolitical context of the UNFCCC. So why do we have a UNFCCC? Well, it has an ultimate objective, which is stated very plainly in the agreement. I'll paraphrase it here, that the ultimate objective is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic or human interference in the climate system. And specifically, it's to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent or avoid that dangerous human impact. So in plain language, humans are making emissions. That's causing the climate crisis. We need to work together as governments to keep that from happening. And it then provides the legal framework in international law for more specific instruments to be agreed between countries. And this is where you start to see, for example, then in 1997, we'll get also on the next slide to the timeline, you get the Kyoto Protocol, you get the Paris Agreement, but those exist under the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention. And theoretically, right, all countries are supposed to be united in climate action under the UNFCCC. Of course, it's political, it's very complicated, it's not as fast as it needs to be, but it does give us a space where every single country has a voice and decisions are taken by consensus, which consensus can be very frustrating, but it is the best method that we've had so far that people have come up with to work on how to get all the countries aligned. So definitely happy in the question and discussion phase to talk about things like, is the UNFCCC still relevant? Does it make progress fast enough or not? Many worthwhile questions to explore there, but it's what we've got. It's also then important to note that within the Framework Convention, they defined specific principles, and then of course other principles have come up along the way over the years. Some of the most important, just to highlight a few of these for you to understand the process. Firstly, you have historical responsibility, which of course is directly related to countries that were already emitting a lot of greenhouse gases in the past that fueled their development. Basically look at United States, UK, Europe. And so they have this historical responsibility to take action. And that's why you saw again that the Kyoto Protocol focused on having developed countries take the lead first to reduce their emissions before developing countries would be asked to also think about minimizing or reducing their emissions. Along with this, you have the polluter pays principle, which is very common and established within environmental law. And yeah, again, you make the emissions, you need to pay to clean that up and fix it. Very straightforward, and becomes relevant as well where we're talking about climate finance. That's a combination of historical responsibility and the polluter pays principle. Put those together, you get $100 billion that is supposed to be provided from developed to developing countries. And then probably the single most quoted principle that you will hear, and that it will all throughout the negotiations, you'll hear people refer to CBDR, CBDR. That is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And this is a very technical way of saying that different countries have different resources and have contributed to different levels to causing the climate crisis. And so we can't expect all countries to have the same obligations, the same responsibilities, the same burdens. Again, feeds right into that reason for why the Kyoto Protocol made developed countries, was supposed to make developed countries, we'll get into that, reduce their emissions, but then was not putting commitments on developing countries to do so. And of course, that is where we've saw a big change then with the Paris Agreement, which of course we'll come to. And then two others, these aren't really necessarily principles that are enshrined, but you'll very often hear these concepts referred to in the negotiations with respect to specific language and how different things should be implemented, that decisions should be implemented in according to national circumstances, which again, every country is its own country. It's going to have a unique situation that you need to take into account. And then you'll hear people speak of a flexible or country-driven approach. And this is, again, the argument that we can't centralize too heavily in the way that things will be implemented, because each country will still have its unique realities on the ground that they need to address. You know, they won't all adapt to climate change in the same way. Mitigation will look different in different countries. And for example, in my area of Action for Climate Empowerment, ACE, where we just had two big rounds, both COP26 and COP27 had really important negotiations for us. You really heard a lot that in the design of the action plan and the work program, that it should be flexible and country driven, because of course, implementing education, training, participation, that becomes very country specific in terms of how their educational system works, how they train people, what does civil society look like in their country. You know, Ghana will look very different from other countries. So you will see these throughout. Now, to then touch upon here some of the key moments in the UNFCCC. I already mentioned this all started from 1992 when parties actually agreed to create the Framework Convention. And of course, then it still took some time for it to make its way through all the national governments and their process for ratifying and actually joining the agreement. So, you know, it took some time, a few more years to get started, but that's where it all began. And with each thing is built on it since then. And so you can then see in 1997, within 5 years, we arrived at the Kyoto Protocol. There's a lot that one could say about all of this, so I'll try to keep it more brief on this history, but this goes directly to where we ended up today. So the Kyoto Protocol was the attempt to get the developed countries to have commitments to reduce their emissions within a certain time frame. And of course, what we then saw was that the United States, while it signed, it then ultimately was not able to ratify within their national government and procedures the agreement. And so that had the effect, of course, of making all the other countries feel like, well, if the United States isn't going to do it, why should we do it? And it actually didn't meet the threshold to enter into force for many years. Then finally, there were some additional ratifications, countries that signed on, and that actually made it cross the threshold. I forget the exact year. This was early 2000s, I think. And then all the countries that had signed it panicked because they said, oh, wait a minute, now it actually has entered into force, and we weren't really doing anything since 1997 because we didn't think it was actually still going to happen. But now we have commitments by 2012 to actually reduce our emissions, and there were supposed to be very strict penalties in there for countries that didn't fulfill that. So of course the Kyoto Protocol had a certain time frame, and even once it did come into force, so we knew we needed to have some agreement that would come next. And this is where you saw a lot of the tensions then evolving between developed and developing countries over what should be that next agreement. Because, of course, the Kyoto Protocol was only putting responsibilities on developed countries. And so developed countries were like, developing countries, you need to also do something. And of course, some of those countries were the rapidly developing countries. Their economies have taken a different shape since 1992, right? By the time we're at 2009. So this is where the Copenhagen Conference happened, which you will have known was widely regarded as a disaster, right? Because they weren't able to get to that universal agreement that would apply to all countries. Whole very interesting, exploration there in terms of reading about what happened, and Obama flying over there and having, side meetings at the last minute with China and other countries. So ultimately, they just took note of the Copenhagen Accord, the proposed agreement. So then they spent the next year, 2010, in Cancun, just sort of rebuilding faith in the process. It's like, can we actually still get a global, agreement? And they rebuilt the process. And of course, Patricia Espinosa from Mexico had a very important role in that conference, prior to her then going on and being the executive secretary for the UNFCCC for the last number of years, before now it's, Simon Steele, who took over just very recently. So this brings us to Durban, COP17, which is where I personally, this was my first COP that I attended. COP28 will be my 10th COP. Yay, double digits. And also I've attended a lot of those SBs in Germany. But Durban was where, like, the way I like to put it is that parties agreed to agree in another 4 years. Because they couldn't actually, like, people had a lot of pressure to try to get the agreement in Durban that we did not get in Copenhagen. And that simply proved not to be feasible. But what they did do was agree on a framework with a deadline of 4 years, which is how we ended up then with, in 2015, the Paris Agreement. And the technical terminology for that was, the ad hoc working group, on the Durban Platform for Enhanced Cooperative Action. It had a technical jargon for it, of course, but it basically was, this is now the space where we will talk about this agreement that we're going to arrive at later. And that was then a whole very interesting process itself. That's where I was in my more full youth activist roots, pushing for things like intergenerational equity to be included in the Paris Agreement, which we did get in the preamble. That's a whole other fascinating story for another time. But of course, everyone in civil society was really pushing on this in the build up to getting the Paris Agreement. And then it was really, divisive as well. There were a lot of different reactions of people to the Paris Agreement, at least that I experienced. Some people felt really happy, like, yay, we finally did it. After 6 years from Copenhagen, we finally got it. And then a lot of the youth activists that I was with were really heartbroken, frankly, because they looked at the agreement and they compared the agreement to the science. And they're like, this isn't anywhere close to the science and what we need to do. And it still is only the beginning of an answer, right? As I already said, it took years of still negotiating and figuring out a lot of the details of the Paris Agreement. So, I can understand both perspectives, and I myself was a little bit in the middle. There were some victories, some things that felt good about it, but then it also felt like it took all this work to get here. We're still kind of far away from where we ultimately need to get to. And so, yeah, 2015 Paris Agreement. And then rather than try to go through all of the following years and every little detail, I trust the other experts who you'll hear in the later sessions will do that for the specific topics that they're covering. They'll be able to, go into for you, which decision about finance or market mechanisms or this or that happened in this specific COP or session. But you can basically summarize from 2016 to now as you can basically summarize that as figuring out more of the details of what the Paris Agreement meant and how parties would do it, and then it's time to implement. And so now all the emphasis on implementation. The one key thing we do really need to note from the Paris Agreement, of course, is the structure of the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions. So that's where, and you'll see that's very relevant even from this year, where they were having the global stock take to check in on, since 2020, when parties first, started up with their formal NDCs after having their intended nationally determined contributions. How are we doing? Are parties being ambitious enough or not? But the NDCs, again, are each country what their emissions reduction targets are. They can further elaborate how they will accomplish that. And every country is supposed to have one, but still in that context of CBDR, where you're expecting much more from the United States and their NDC, or the EU and their NDC, than you would be expecting from a small island country that barely has any emissions, but is extremely vulnerable. So here I just mentioned some of the key issues. We've already touched on a few of them, but mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, climate finance, market mechanisms, technology transfer, my personal one, action for climate empowerment. You also have gender, has an action plan, has a whole agenda item within the process, and many, many, many more. I mean, there's more than 70 plus agenda items going on at the same time at these sessions. You can't possibly follow everything, and that leads to some of the dynamics that we'll also be talking about further. So that brings us into how climate negotiations work. We start to get into some of the fun technical things now. So it's important to understand that the dynamics mostly play out in terms of groups of countries, or parties in this context, right? So some of these are listed here. You have the G77 in China, the African group. So of course, Ghana, part of the African group, the Alliance of Independent Latin American Countries, ILAC. So they've got their regional grouping. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. So a lot of those rapidly developing countries, or Russia, which has always been in a very unique place within the climate negotiations, but finding themselves in alignment with those other countries. You have the so-called umbrella group, which just catches some other countries that don't really fit into the other groupings. The United States is there, Canada, Japan, Australia, I think also New Zealand. So you have a lot of the developed countries, those countries, you'll see the umbrella. And so say, oh, the umbrella group is, taking a position against finance, or, something like that. That's why it's a lot of the leading developed countries. I didn't mention the EU, but the EU formally participates as a group. And that is a more formal arrangement than for these other groups, which are more informal and still consensus based, because the EU is actually a very complicated, legally binding instrument. So its member countries are actually very legally bound by their own regulations internally to the EU position and how they formulate that. Whereas, pick any two countries in the G77 in China or even the African group, they don't have that legal aspect. It's more that they respect the group and how the group operates and comes to a common consensus position. And this then plays out in the negotiations where different parties will be the one to take the lead on the different agenda items, and they will hold coordination meetings that their colleagues from other countries will attend, and they basically say, hey, I'm following this item, this is what's going on in the negotiations, I need your inputs and views on this position. And then they leave that meeting with a mandate, and then they actually go and take the floor and speak on behalf of the entire group in the agenda item that they're following. So it's a whole very, very intricate process. Let me also try to note if people are bringing up any questions in the chat. I'll try to address things as I go along. So please do ask things in the chat. And of course, we'll get the full Q&A discussion later on. But there isn't a South Asia specific group as a negotiating group in the UNFCCC. We're being very specific to what groups of countries align together for the negotiations. So you will find that there are a lot of these other groupings, like even like the G7 or the G20. No, those aren't actually formal negotiating blocks within the UNFCCC. There's also some that are as small as 3 countries, like you have ABU, which is simply Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. So just those 3 countries made their own group. Yeah, so you'll have then all these different groups, and it really plays out in the dynamics of the negotiations, which we're going to keep talking about here. So a lot of countries, they only have so many delegates that they have the resources to be able to send to these meetings. And this becomes one of the inequalities in the process, of which there are many inequalities in the process, but one of them is very much delegation sizes. Because when you have so many agenda items happening at the same time, you need someone in that room to be representing you. And if you're not in the room, you can't propose text, you can't object to text that is against your interests. And so that's also, again, why a lot of the groups of countries are groups and they coordinate, is that they simply wouldn't, each country doesn't have enough people to go everywhere, so they team up. And you will see this disparity a lot. You can look, it's a matter of public information. You can look up the records from the UNFCCC process of who participates. And so you can see and count the delegates from the countries. Now, I have to put an asterisk on that, because party overflow badges, they get treated differently, and like that's a whole other side conversation for how the Secretariat's trying to improve accountability and transparency of the process. But you can at least go and count all the formal delegates from the governments, and you'll see, for example, the United States can send over 100 delegates just by themselves to a conference. So that's, if there's 70 plus agenda items, the US can have, one person in every single room, and then 30 people who are also in the office doing things to help them follow what's going on. And of course, the delegates are constantly talking back to their government, right, in their country. So of course, countries that have more staff in their government back at home, US has a lot of lawyers for our delegation, they are able to be getting more of that support as well. So And some of the funding from the UNFCCC budget that does go from developed to developing countries is specifically to help fund more delegates from any of the developing countries to be able to attend. But of course, that is still a relatively small number of people being supported. And then, there's so many issues of contention, climate finance being one of the most prominent of those, of course. The $100 billion commitment not being delivered yet gets into issues of how you count climate finance, right? If before climate change, a government was already providing, international development funding, well, can they now try to make that count as climate finance by putting a climate spin on it in addition to a development spin? So it's not technically new money, but they want to count it as climate finance, or is it new and additional funds that didn't already exist? So lots there that gets debated. Of course, loss and damage is one that you will have heard about. We have mitigation. We want to make the emissions less, so the climate impacts are less. Adaptation, even if we mitigate, the climate is already impacted and will still be more impacted. So we need to minimize how harmful that is, the adaptation. But then what about the things that are so bad that adaptation isn't enough? That's your loss and damage. That is Fiji and Tuvalu and Kiribati being underwater. That is them drowning. They do not exist anymore. That's also, we're looking at Ghana, desertification. A lot of serious things that will have costs, will have impacts. And so that has linked back to finance as well. One of the key decisions from COP27 was, and I was a little surprised to actually see it get through, but working on creating it, it's still, of course, under negotiation how it will happen, but at least agreeing to create some kind of a new financial mechanism for loss and damage. So a lot going on. And then within all of that, parties even still have to agree on the agenda, right? And there's a lot of ways that you can argue over what's on the agenda, what isn't on the agenda. Oh, you want to put your preferred topic on the agenda? Well, you can only do that if I can put my preferred topic on the agenda, which is one you don't like, and I don't like yours. And then they end up just deadlocked, fighting over the agenda. Yeah, so much can happen there. Let me just catch up on the chat for a moment. So who gets selected as delegates from developing countries? So that's entirely up to the discretion of the government, right? Who will be the formal delegates with the party badge on behalf of the country. How can you access funding to be represented from a CSO? Also a good question. I think I have a whole section that's about how to participate in things. So I think we'll come back to those questions when we get to there. Those are very good questions, though. So the last bit here on how the negotiations work, I just mentioned about the agenda setting. But then, of course, you've got the plenaries. These are just the big formal, the biggest room, you see everybody sitting all there, and you get the most long formal statements made by parties. And then sometimes toward the end of the COP or the SB, you'll get some drama over, whether they agree or disagree with the different decisions that are on the table. But no actual textual negotiations are happening there. That's happening rather in the informal consultations, which are the smaller rooms where the negotiators for specific topics will sit down and work on that topic. And you'll even see the secretariat will be there supporting. They'll have their laptop open with a Word document. If they have a draft text, it'll be there. They'll be taking track changes in red as parties are negotiating and proposing to add things or, cut things. And then you can also get the informal informals. We affectionately call them inf-imps. And this is where they don't even have the formal co-facilitators or secretariat of the process there. It's just basically an informal conversation between the parties. And usually you'll see that happening where they can't agree on something. And so they want to be able to have a less formal setting to to try to sort it out together. And then they have to bring those decisions back to the informal consultations. Important to note as well that these informal consultations, and especially INFIMFs, oftentimes will end up closed to observers, right? So if you're from a CSO, you're on an observer badge, you may not be able to get into those rooms. And that also generates a lot of controversy. You know, it's not transparent if observers aren't allowed in, you know, but it does also serve a role in the process because parties understandably don't necessarily, like, they can't talk to each other in the same level of candidness and bluntness with media in the room, right? So there are certain times where they kind of do need to actually be given some space from us observers who constantly want to be like, what are you doing? What are you doing? We have proposals. We want you to do this. Yeah, at a certain point, they also need their space. And I've seen it from both sides, right? I started out as the observer who's like, I want to get in. Why is it closed? This isn't fair. And then I've also seen it from the party side where it's like, we're just trying to figure out how we can agree together, and all the pressure from outside the room is not actually helping unless you have a specific text you want to hand us that helps us to actually get to consensus. And then within that, you may have seen pictures, or again, if you've previously attended sessions, you'll have seen huddles, and that's literally where they suspend the formal meeting. They're like, okay, the meeting is suspended for 5 minutes, and then all the negotiators run to one particular part of the room, or even sometimes to their country groupings within the room, and they're literally just arguing with each other over, can we get to an agreement finally on something that works? And then they'll come back and sit down and be formal again, and then acknowledge their agreement if they came to one, or they'll just be like, yeah, we still didn't agree, and it gets delayed. Very good question for the moment then. How does consensus-based decision making influence the outcomes of a particular decision? So, yeah, very good question. Consensus is formally defined as the absence of formal objections. So it doesn't mean all the parties are happy that they like the decision, but it does mean they're not objecting to it. And then it can be considered to go ahead. And what that essentially means is that any one country, or especially any group of countries, can block a decision. And this again becomes very controversial. People will feel like certain countries are abusing that to block progress, but it goes both ways, right? So sometimes it'll be developed countries that are blocking consensus because, they don't like it. But then other times it'll be the small islands or the developed countries that are blocking consensus because they also don't feel that the decision is good for them yet. So it really just puts all the countries on basically the same playing field. There's a lot of interesting, I've seen, some academic debates with folks about, should we use a majority vote or some different version than consensus? Yeah, it's interesting to think about from a theoretical standpoint, but practically, yeah, this is what we've got. In fact, the reason that they still take the decisions by consensus is that they could never actually agree on a different method of taking the decisions. So it's like, we couldn't get consensus on using something different than consensus, so I guess we're stuck taking decisions by consensus. So that's where you will actually see that the rules of procedure that govern the whole process, they're actually still the draft rules of procedure, because one of those rules was on decision making. And so because they couldn't agree on that one specific rule, they had to agree to implement all the other rules of the draft rules of procedure, except the one rule. I went very, very in the weeds there, but it helps you to see just how complicated the process is, especially with respect to decision making and consensus. Very good question. And then, of course, countries can still have meetings between two countries, a bilateral, between 3 or more countries, a multilateral. And then there's also the coffee line chats. You literally just, you go grab coffee with the other negotiator and talk about the negotiations and ask them, okay, hey, look, I know you needed to say this. That's your formal position, but like, come on, can you work with me here? Can we figure something out before we have to go back into the room and, you know, disagree with each other again? Negotiators are people too, right? So all these human dynamics are also a factor. So now we're getting to a very important and popular part that helps bring us toward a lot of the other questions from the chat. How to engage in all of this complicated process as civil society. So in short, there are many, many ways to do that. Many people from civil society, I'll generally call them the observers or those non-party stakeholders term that we had, you know, they have different objectives, right? If you're there from academia, you might have research that you've done that is on mitigation or oceans or whatever, and you go to COP or SB to present that research to people who will find it useful. You might, if you're a student, that's how I got my start in the process, was I went with some professors to Durban and they had us doing research interviews. So we picked different topics and we interviewed people, and then we wrote up research from that. So you'll run into a lot of people who are doing research, asking you for research interviews. You could write your dissertation based off of questions that you could ask people at these meetings. And of course, you've got people from, you know, every country, so many organizations. So there's just so many experts there. And a lot of them are using that to network between experts, present all the latest, you know, IPCC reports or other updates. You might also then want to do advocacy, right? You know, you have a position you want to see parties adopt, and so you try to make that happen. And that's a whole other that's a whole capacity building series on its own of how do you actually do effective advocacy. Because it's tricky, but it's doable, right? We've had success stories and also unhappy stories from just the ACE working group of Youngo, where, you know, sometimes we succeed and we get things in, and other times, you know, we don't. But if you know how to go about it, then you can make a difference there. And, you know, always just the pressure from civil society is there to try to help keep countries accountable to their commitments, and, for example, to support, you know, the small island states, to, you know, remind them that, you know, they have a lot of support, for example, from civil society. Then you run into the different levels and types of access. I mentioned already how some sessions will be closed to observers. So if you're on the observer badge, you won't get into the closed meetings for parties, but there are actually some sessions that are closed to parties. That's usually because those are meetings that are just for observers with the executive secretary or the SBI or substa chairs. So it's kind of funny when you see parties trying to go into those rooms, and the UN security is like, nope, sorry, this is closed to you. So it does cut both ways a little bit. And then, of course, there's media accreditation. So if you're actually representing a formal media entity, you can get a media badge, which then lets you have access to some areas that are just for media, but then it also keeps you out of a lot of the other rooms where observers would be allowed, but media is not allowed. But it's lots of people do media there, so that might be how you would engage. You could just have one person in your team maybe who's going to be focused on media, and you can partner with a journalistic media entity to get the media badge. Again, various strategies and goals, why you're there, what you're trying to do. Worth noting as well, the formal constituency groups. So there are 9 constituencies. That's all the ones that you would expect basically from the major groups from elsewhere in the UN system. You have youth, women, you have farmers, you have business, you have academia, etc. Indigenous peoples, very important one as well. And they'll all have their advocacy and their internal things and all the stuff they're trying to do. And then there's also submissions that happen. So this is where parties will say, let's have a call for everyone, parties, observers, to give their inputs on this specific topic. And then you write up a formal document and you get to submit it, and then it's published through the UNFCCC website and can play a role in your advocacy strategies and other things that you're trying to do. Within this, we are now at the interactive question part. So before fully opening the floor for questions, let me come back to some of the ones that you already brought up in the chat. Just as a time check, we're pretty much right on time. It's a 90-minute session, so we still have over half an hour for addressing any of the questions or discussion. So keep those coming in the chat, or also we'll open the floor in a moment. So let's see. If you could elaborate more on the question, so does it mean we don't bring parties together for negotiation? I'm not sure I understand what you mean with the question. So yeah, would help if you could elaborate on that. I see people asking how to access funding. Yep. So from the CSO. Funding is always the tricky one. I won't sugarcoat it, right? There's not enough funding that goes around to support civil society. But I've not gone to, for example, the UNEA process in Nairobi, but I know from colleagues who have that, for example, they actually give a stipend. They have a DSA that civil society can request to be able to attend. That does not exist for the UNFCCC process, sadly. I wish it did. That would really, really be helpful, but it does not. So you need to look at those who could provide, funding to help out. Speaking from the youth perspective, we've done through Youngo, we've done Global South scholarships in the past. I helped run those for COP23. So we had 30 people, youth from the Global South, who were funded to that COP by the German government. Youngo previously had funding from Norway or the French government. We had some funding actually when I was working with Fiji for the ACE Youth Forum in 2018 that funded 40 people from the Global South to participate in that in Bonn. I know people reach out to philanthropy organizations to seek funding support. You can reach out for CSR, your corporate social responsibility entities. You're going to have to show some value proposition to them in terms of, what are they going to get out of funding you, besides just the good publicity, because there is a lot of tokenization of youth engagement, and to a wider extent, maybe a little bit civil society. But if you're coming at it from a youth angle, there'll be people who may want to look good, say, "Oh, look, we funded youth to be here." Whether or not they give you capacity building and support to have that be meaningful is another question. We made sure we did that in both the GSS and the AYF that I mentioned. We made that a necessary component, but it may not always be. Let me see the questions. Hopefully I know it's not the best satisfying answer, that I can't just say, "Oh, it's easy here, go get funding there." But we do our best to help each other with it. So, reach out to others in Youngo, or who might be able to help. We do that in the ACE working group, for example. My apologies to anyone who does not find the youth examples relevant, but I can't help but talk about them because that's been my experience. But of course, civil society is not only youth. All right, elaborate more on how observers can engage in the UNFCCC. So I touched on this a little bit. If you've got some more specific questions, I'm happy to go deeper onto those. But essentially, civil society, they can do kind of their own internal things at the COP because it is the biggest annual gathering of everyone for climate. So you'll see a lot of civil society that's organizing side events. They'll organize pavilions, and they'll use that to network, to plan, to strategize, connect. And then, of course, there's actually trying to influence the negotiations, which is where things, as I said, get very technical, and doing the advocacy is a whole topic unto itself. But not everyone from civil society who goes to COP is even actually paying attention to the negotiations, at least in any technical way. You can bring up some really interesting debates actually around civil society and how they engage with the COP and why they're there. This has actually come up. There was a whole consultation process last year by the Secretariat that, still hasn't fully concluded, produced outcomes on how to make observer engagement better in the UNFCCC process. And a lot of it has to do with how do you deal with so many observers? It's a huge number. It's growing all the time. Constantly more organizations are being admitted. That's where badges come from. I know there had been a question about badges. So, you have NGOs that get the observer status with the UNFCCC, then they get given an allocation, a quota of badges. It's always way fewer badges than you would like to have. And then those NGOs are deciding how they give those badges to people. And then also sometimes, like for example, Youngo actually has badges that people can apply for to Youngo. They're not Youngo's badges, but they get them from organizations, and then Youngo decides who gets them. Some of the larger networks like CAN International, Climate Action Network, they often will be a place to help their members get badges from different organizations and share them to people coming from organizations that don't have the observer status, to get their own badges. Myself, right, I have badges for my NGO doing the youth participation. So people apply to us, and then I try to make a delegation internationally to be representative of all the regions and everything. So we'll have some from Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc. Let me keep
Is
up.
it okay if I jump in?
It's your session.
Yes.
So yeah, please.
So please, are you done with the presentation? Then maybe we can just give, because I've realized that the questions keep coming. So are we at the Q&A session? And
Yes. We
okay.
Well, in the time that you rejoined, we moved into the Q&A session. Yes. So that's where we are right now.
Great. Okay, so there was this question from, I think, Daniel Anaba. What could be the reasons for the delay in implementation of the decision taken at these negotiations?
Yeah, that's also a good one. I did see we had a hand up from someone. Seems we missed that, so we might also come back to that one. But for that question from the chat, in what sense are we meaning delays, right? So if the delay, if we're talking about the process of making the decision, right, there's any number of reasons why consensus may be still blocked between countries. They haven't agreed on it, so that's why it isn't moving forward yet until they can agree. Or if we're talking about a decision that's already been agreed, well, it still is upon countries to actually implement it, right? And if I go back again to the ACE examples, we have a work program. We've had decades worth of work programs that says all these wonderful things that parties could do, but it's all voluntary. So it's up to a party if they want to do it or not. Even the action plan, okay, it's more formal than a work program, but still, ultimately, it's flexible, it's country driven. The language matters, so there's a lot of as appropriate or in a position to do so. that will be in the actual text of the decision, and then parties might say, oh, well, it wasn't appropriate. Oh, we weren't in a position to do it, so this didn't apply to us. And even the NDCs, again, right? It's nationally determined contributions. So it's up to each country. And the only accountability mechanism is peer pressure, basically. And that's what the GST, the global stocktake process, is for, is to give a formal mechanism to put that peer pressure on countries by making them come before the whole group of countries and say, justify their NDC. So if other countries like, yo, United States, why you're not saying you're going to reduce your emissions enough? Why is that? And then the United States has to explain in front of all the countries why they picked the targets that they did. And that applies for all the different countries. I pick out the United States because I'm from the US, and I also don't always feel that I'm represented by the positions that my government takes, but yeah, that's domestic politics. But yeah, so I hope that shed some light for that question.
I hope, Daniel, you are answered, and it's okay. We have Kokovu. Kokovu, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. So I was asking if there are calls for project proposal submissions. Before that, yeah, I must say that the webinar has really been insightful. Yes, and I want to find out if there has been any call for project proposal submissions where maybe in organizations that have some proposals, yeah, can submit those proposals to maybe some funders. If there are no calls like that, how do you locate funders during the COP? Yeah, so that's my first question. Then the second one is, how do you engage more as observers? Because as you were saying, yeah, when you go there, there are different things going on at the same time, different negotiations going on at the same time. So as observers, how do you gain maximum benefit from the negotiations that are ongoing?
All right, thank you.
Thank
Tim?
you.
Yeah, so these are both really good questions. So let me make sure I address both of them. So to the funding, the project proposals, I would love to say, again, that it's easy because here's this centralized place where that happens. And that's actually something that, because it doesn't exist really, we've had as a demand coming from, specifically the ACE working group of Youngo, where we were trying to get parties to create such a platform specific to ACE projects. So, you would have a space in which you could put your proposals for projects and try to link those up with philanthropies, CSR, all those different sources of funding. But, otherwise you kind of just have to go out there and, try to look up which foundations are funding climate things. Bloomberg funds a lot of climate things. Gates Foundation, I think, has some climate things. Unilever, I know, likes to fund a lot of climate and sustainability kinds of things. They might put out specific calls for projects. Sometimes governments, of course, will have various grants or projects that they're doing. Sometimes USAID or the State Department will have some specific grants that are being made available for other countries to do climate or development. But there's not just a nice, easy, centralized place for that. There are some of of course, you've got the Green Climate Fund, GCF. That's very hard to access funding from because you technically need to access it with the partnership and approval of a government. But there is a way that civil society organizations can get a kind of recognition from the GCF. But that's quite a tricky one. Then, of course, there's the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. They have their small grants program. I know that one has been more successful for people who are trying to get these kinds of projects related to climate to be funded. They'll have specific calls that they put out. I'm not familiar off the top of my head of what any of the currently active calls are, but there are some of those directions you can go in, and it's an area where we need to keep pushing as civil society to make those financial mechanisms better, or to create them where they're missing, so that it does work more like it should, becomes easier for all of us. And of course, organizations collaborating together, I personally believe, always makes stronger proposals, makes it more likely to attract funding. So I'm a big believer in partnerships between organizations from different countries to try to work on those same goals. And then to the second question, I mean, it's a very big one. So, there are different strategies that we implement. For example, within Youngo, Youngo has so many different working groups, not just ACE. So they're all working together to make sure at least one person from that group of observers manages to get in the room to follow the negotiations and then take the notes and report those back for everybody. Because you'll often see, for example, that in the smaller rooms, each of those 9 constituencies I mentioned will maybe only get 1 or 2 seats reserved for them. So only 1 or 2 youth might make it in, or 1 or 2 indigenous make it in. So you have to have shared notes and then strategize and work together around that. You have to set up bilateral meetings with parties. So, you identify which parties, because only parties can introduce text, right? So if you've got text you want to see get in, you need a party to be the champion for that. So you would have your proposal, you'd write it up nicely, you'd think about which country is going to be more likely to agree with you, and then you track down their delegate in the COP and talk to them and try to convince them to do something with your text. Again, that's a whole deeper capacity building topic in and of itself to talk, to go into how we do that, and our different success examples of how we've done that with ACE or intergenerational equity in other areas. But you really need to be focused. That's also the thing I would say, is go to COP with a goal, a focus, a specific thing you want to do. I tell all my delegates that, because otherwise you get lost, you drown. There is so much happening, and you'll just be chasing one shiny pavilion event to another shiny pavilion event, and you'll find yourself sitting drinking coffee in the UNFCCC pavilion, and and then you ask yourself at the end of the COP, what did I really accomplish or get out of this? So have a goal, align with other people who are there to pursue that same goal, and then you're going to feel like you got an impact out of it, and your funding and resources to be there and time to be there were justified.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. I think from the perspective of the center, we are making arrangements, because I can tell a lot of participants are interested in financing, funding. We are making arrangements to get in touch with somebody from our Ghana's Ministry of Finance to talk on climate financing. So probably he can give us an education on the various options available, including the GCF, the JEF processes, how to apply, and how people, civil societies can take advantage of, the facility. Yes, still going through the questions. There is, Tim, there's a question from, sorry, let me just check. Okay, there's a question from Mohammed Awa. He's asking if it's not possible for UN to institute a dedicated funding to support 100 participants annually from the Global South.
Well, I mean, in short, the answer is yes, it's possible. They could do that. But the but is you would need a consensus of governments to agree to do that. And then that, of course, means someone has to pay for it, right? It always comes back to money and who has to pay for it. And most of the money from the UN system is from commitments, obligations from developed countries. So this is why every time, whether it's UNFCCC or anywhere in the UN, you start to talk about doing anything, and doing things costs money. That's everywhere in the negotiation decisions. You can look down. It's usually like at the very end of it, you will see that they say takes note of the estimated budgetary implications of this decision. And then they say that all actions in this decision will be implemented, quote, subject to the availability of financial resources. So this is why a lot of the things that we want and that we could have, we don't get, because parties are always saying, yeah, but that would cost money, even if it's just staff, right, in the UN. How are you going to select those 100 people? Who's going to do their travel logistics? Who's going to write the reports, right? I mean, we're talking staff who have to do that. So that's a cost. The GCF, very expensive. They had to create a headquarters for it. They had to have a staff for it. I know someone who was an intern at the GCF, actually there at the headquarters, and she was telling me all about like the compliance office and then the complaints that they get. And it's, so anything you want to do becomes expensive, and it's just down then to the willingness of which countries are going to pay for it. And that's where all these things get stuck.
Yeah, we have a hand up. Let me check. Okay, I don't know whether it's still Kokovi. Okay, so it's Kokovi. Do you have a follow-up question, or is the same order?
Yeah, I have some questions. Yeah. So thank you very much for the answers that you gave to my question. So I want to find out, as an observer, if you have an ongoing research on climate change and you want to present. I think when Tim was talking, he made mention of the fact that when you go for COP with maybe academics, yeah, you can present your research over there for deliberations to be held on that. So I want to find out, if you are going as an observer and you have a research ongoing, how do you collaborate with these academics so that at least you can maybe make your voice on the research heard? Thank you.
Yeah, this is, there may be someone who's better placed to answer that question, who's actually from academia or an academic institution. So maybe Hussein, some of your future experts will be more aligned with that. What I can say is, a good place also for resources to go is academic institutions, because they usually, they're not overflowing with money, but they do have money, right? And they can at least afford to send a few of their people oftentimes to these meetings. And a lot of the observer organizations that are admitted and they have the badges are also academic organizations, institutions. So they have both some ability to get badges themselves to give to people and also some funding to get them there. So, my suggestion would be, use those kinds of relationships, figure out who an academic institution might be sending. If they're not an observer to have badges, you can always propose that they become one. It takes some time, but then they do eventually get access to the badges. I have another one of my many free consulting things that I have done is give people advice on how to, get admitted as an observer. So, and then also look at the Ringo constituency. That's the research and independent NGOs, one of the 9 I mentioned. And that's where they don't do advocacy at all, but they're always trying to make the best available science there for parties to take in the decisions, or to help them in implementation of the decisions. So yeah, that's probably not the best answer. There'll be someone else who's better placed for it, but I hope that at least helps a little bit.
Yes, that's very true. We Professor Kluche, Professor Kluche of the University of Ghana, he's part of the IPCC. Will be joining us, I think, on the 16th. And yes, make time to join her session. I'm sure she'll be in a very good position to answer some of these questions. Yes. Yeah, hello, Tim. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, someone is asking whether it's possible for the UN, Muhammad Awa is asking whether it's possible for the UNFCCC Secretariat to be decentralized to member countries. I don't know whether you understand the question.
Yeah, it might help to elaborate the question a little bit more in terms of, what would you hope to see accomplished or be different or done better through the decentralization? Because, as I was thinking about the question, I wasn't sure what that would really mean to decentralize it, because it is the framework convention that serves the parties. That's its mandate. And so, they have, for example, the regional climate weeks that the Secretariat does. So in a way, that's decentralizing a little bit because they're going down from the global level and supporting activities at the regional level. UNFCCC, of course, can still partner with or support relevant activities that are being organized at the national level. But of course, they aren't having staff outside of Germany and Bonn, where the headquarters is. So, and those staff are coming from, I mean, they're people from all over the world, from many different nationalities working there for the UN. So maybe I've not, hit on the question well, and a follow-up can clarify that. But it's an interesting idea, right? Like how can you make the Secretariat more relevant, more broadly?
I think one extra thing is, let's take note of the fact that we have each country has observer for each agenda item. So for Ghana, for each agenda item, there's an focal point. So let's take ACE. There's a focal point for ACE. When it comes to mitigation, there's a focal point for mitigation. So that is how the communication is channeled from the UNFCCC. So if you want anything done, the best person to target is your national focal point. So there's a national focal point for UNFCCC, and there's a focal point for each of the agenda items. So yes, maybe as part of the capacity building sessions, we'll be listing some of the focal points and possibly their email addresses, and you can get in touch with them in case you have, an idea or a project you want to do in relation to their area. Just going again to whether we have any, we have just a few minutes to go. Mohammed Tabanja is asking whether, so he's asking that he has an idea to implement, and he wants to do it an idea to implement with the Ministry of Education, and he already has his funding. How can the UNFCCC support him?
All right, so if I understand, there's a project proposal, there's funding support from the national level. So how might UNFCCC be part of that? So, and it's related to education. So we're talking about ACE. So the Secretariat of the UNFCCC has a team who, of course, covers ACE. And so you could reach out to them either directly or through your ACE focal point, assuming you have an ACE focal point, or through the national focal point otherwise, and engage them that way. And they might have experts that they could provide you. They could maybe provide resources in terms of handbooks, toolkits. There was a collaboration between the UNFCCC and UNESCO that produced a toolkit related to how to implement some of the ACE provisions. So yeah, they're most likely, they're not going to really be part of implementing what you're doing, but again, they might have some experts or resources that would be useful to you. The biggest thing also is if you're still trying to secure support in your country for an ACE project, then you can always, when you go and talk to your government, you can say, hey, this ACE thing is important. Here are the decisions that have been taken. Our government is supposed to be doing something to implement these things. And here's my proposal for, what we could be doing to implement that. So it can give you a little bit more credibility as well. But don't expect a very direct role or involvement from the UNFCCC in national level projects or things.
Okay, we have some few minutes to go. Yes, I think so far the session has been, quite educative. Like I said, we have a number of upcoming sessions, including loss and damage. So we are going to have the focal points. So like I said, one main person you can target is the national focal point, because they do the project at the country level when it comes to, or they liaise with the UNFCCC. Okay, Kokovi, we are getting out of time, but yes, I'll still give you the opportunity to ask your last question.
Okay, thank you. So I think you made mention of the fact that Professor Kluchi will be joining on one of the sessions. I want to find out whether she is the one at University of Ghana, the physicist.
Please, she's the one.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Somebody will be speaking on loss and damage. Hopefully, we are hoping to get the focal point. And the good thing is we have the focal points for UNFCCC. He will also be joining us, and he'll be talking on global goal on adaptation. We have somebody to talk the focal point for action for climate empowerment will be joining us. So we have lined up a session of capacity building sessions, and we hope that at the end of this, in this period, you should be able to understand everything that revolves around negotiations as far as COP28 is concerned. I would like to use this opportunity to thank Tim for making time to do this, to facilitate this session, or to do this session with us. It's been quite educative and quite inspiring. Our next session is going to be on Wednesday, and it's going to be on global goal on adaptation, GGA, and Dr. Entry Bosiako will be joining us. He will be facilitating the session. And then let me finally also add that all participants who are able to participate throughout the sessions, at least 80% of the session will have an electronic certificate, just indicating that they've been part of the session, they've learned something, and yes, we've impacted some knowledge to them. So it's been grateful once again on behalf of the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Empowerment, CCSE. We want to thank all of you for making time of your out of your busy schedule to join this session. We hope to see you on Wednesday. And once again, Tim, thank you so much. Thank you. It's been quite educative, engaging, and very empowering. Thank you. And hope to see all of you. Please join the WhatsApp group because we'll be notifying you through the WhatsApp group because that's the easiest way that we can send all the reminders the moment the meeting is about to start. Once again, Tim, thank you. And once again, thank you to all the participants. See you on Wednesday. Bye-bye. I'll share the WhatsApp group link. Let me share the WhatsApp group link right now so you can join. Okay, the WhatsApp group link will be sent through your email again as the last reminder. Okay, so my colleague has sent it in the message. Once again, thank you and see you all on Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Good to be here.